Hi class, so this week we are doing what is most challenging reading of the entire course from this book. Don't worry, I've just given you the much more accessible introduction. Witzel's monumental Origin of the World's Mythologies was published in 2012. Not only is it safe to say it's one of the most incredible texts written in the field of world mythology since Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bow, since all of Mircea Eliade's writings in comparative religion and mythology, since Vico's The New Science. Basically any text you can ever think of written about myth and world myth in particular, this book could be said to rank alongside those, and in most, if not all cases, to outrank them. The sheer scope and breadth of Witzel's studies of all the available mythological primary sources just baffles comprehension. That doesn't necessarily mean that his overarching theory in the book is correct, but if there's anyone in the world currently writing today on world mythology who would be most qualified to bring in the tools of various interdisciplinary sciences in order to construct a global theory of the origin of myth, it would be Witzel. So no worries if anyone out there, including your professor, feels a little bit out of our depth this week. Witzel's achievement is the result of an incredibly attuned scientific mind and decades upon decades of thorough reading of basically all the world's mythological traditions, as well as various sciences and other disciplines in the humanities and human sciences. The blurb says, focusing on the oldest available text, buttressed by data from archaeology, comparative linguistics, and human population genetics, Witzel constructs a single original African source for our collective myths, dating back some 100,000 years, identifying features shared by this out-of-Africa mythology and its northern Eurasian offshoots. Witzel suggests that these common myths recounted in the communities of the, quote, African Eve are the earliest evidence of ancient spirituality. Moreover, these common features, he shows, survive today in all major world religions. You may have noticed the theme in our course so far, beginning with sources from Babylonian period and working gradually back into Inanna and then into the Neolithic period, and then in Egypt, beginning with Plutarch and then working gradually back through the findings of Egyptology and into some speculations about religion and myth during the Middle and Kingdoms and Old Kingdoms, and taking both those things and working back towards the Neolithic, maybe the Paleolithic at best. All this combines to mean that so far in our course we've been trying to ask this same question that Witzel is asking, the question about origins. Here with Witzel, and on an actually scientific basis, we're being asked to go to the earliest strata of human consciousness and myth, at least 100,000 years in terms of time depth. The big question is, of course, how could we possibly know anything about time depths that deep? To answer this question, Witzel poses another question. Why do so many world myths written in vastly different parts of the globe and across so many different periods of history display extremely similar features and insights? Note that Witzel's purpose here isn't just to explain why myths are similar, but to use the evidence of similarity of myths in order to assemble evidence for earlier stratas of mythical thinking in the human species. This sort of grand totalizing theory or meta-narrative is not very fashionable at the moment. It would probably be fair to say that the emphasis on difference and context is one of the hallmarks of postmodernity. The difference between Witzel's construction of a primordial world historical ur-mythology or basic plot for global consciousness and myth from the earliest strata of human history, the motivation for this in Witzel may be a bit romantic, even a bit problematic, but what we should really be evaluating, I think, is the execution and the rigor and criticality of his claims, the science behind his arguments, and whether or not his theory is a plausible contribution from the point of view critical and well-researched thought. And on that level, it may well be that Witzel is correct in his theory, even if the format and the argumentation in his theory isn't particularly appealing to postmodern sensibilities. So the biggest takeaway from Witzel's theory is the idea that mythic storylines, organizing meta-narratives, or the basic systematic plot of a system of myths can be divided into two different types. Initially, in the earliest dawn of human history, there was what he calls the Gondwana, or Afro-Australian mythical storyline, which Witzel sees attested among the Australian Aborigines, who we'll also be covering this week, as well as the Melanesians of New Guinea and in sub-Saharan Africa. We can recognize the Gondwana mythical worldview and storyline because it lacks certain elements from the second type, which is the Laurasian one. According to Witzel, the Gondwana storyline was told in Africa and spread out from Africa some 65,000 years ago, and sort of beelined along the coastline of the Indian Ocean via Arabia, India, and the Sundaland to Australia. So the Gondwana storyline did spread through the initial migration of the human species more or less over more than half the world, although remnants of it today reside mainly in the southern hemispheres. Now, according to Witzel, another mythical storyline, which he calls Laurasian, developed among a subset of Gondwana people between 50,000 and 20,000 years ago, that is the dates for the early Paleolithic, and became dominant the world over and is even the basis of all the global religions. Witzel's use of the term Gondwana and Laurasian here are inventive. He's basically taking two geological concepts and applying them to the cultural sphere. According to geologists, at a much, much earlier date than that which Witzel is concerned with, all the continents of the world were part of a supercontinent, which was Pangaea. Witzel's theory is not confusing the timeline here, since the vast majority of mythical evidence we have comes from what Witzel calls the Laurasian model. We begin there. And Witzel asks, how is it possible that the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish, the Rig Veda of the Indians, which we'll study next week, the New Zealand Maori creation stories have so many similar, almost identical features? The standard answers given in the 20th century were either that of a worldwide diffusion from an ancient cultural center such as Egypt, or that of universal innate characteristics of the human psyche, such as the archetypes that create similar myths anytime and anywhere. Both these answers can be very effective in explanation, but they are not nearly correct or comprehensive enough to explain all the extremely close similarities in global myth. So Witzel proposes a new approach. Let's use fusion theory where applicable and the theory of meaning where insightful, but why not bring in other relevant disciplines as well as the scientific method? Since more northern or Laurasian mythical storylines almost invariably involve stories about the origin and the end of the world, it is indeed puzzling that Gondwana myth seems to lack such creation narratives. Like Armstrong in her chapter on the Paleolithic, Witzel imagines a Pangaean substrate in which humans are created by a distant Otios or lazy sky god and are imperfect and doomed to death. This element of Pangaean mythology is still central to the Laurasian offshoots. However, other Gondwana elements persist only as residual or isolated, not part of the official storyline, and most often found in folktales. Witzel calls the Laurasian storyline humanity's first novel, or a metaphor of the human condition, of human life from its mysterious beginnings to its ominous end. The specific details of this narrative, seldom to be found in Gondwana myths, include emergence, Father Heaven, Mother Earth, and their offspring, the defeat and displacement of current gods over their predecessors, that is, myths of succession, the hidden sun revealed, the defeat of the dragon, the birth of humanity, Promethean acts of bringing culture by a hero or a shaman, the emergence of local nobility and local history, and a final destruction, usually involving a myth of the 4 or the 5 ages, as well as an eventual rebirth or heaven or a new earth. Witzel's definition of myth is definitely the most interesting and comprehensive one we'll encounter in the course. A myth is symbolic or fabulous narrative. It is told and recited at special occasions. It is to some extent standardized. It is collectively owned and managed, often by specialists, and is considered by its owners to be of great and enduring significance. Such myths contain and bring out images of the world, cosmology, past and present society, history and sociology, the human condition, and are eminently constitutive of the life of a society. So ultimately, myths are powerful devices to create collectively underpinned meaning and collectively recognized truths. Witzel's comments on the theory of myth are certainly far more professional and in-depth than in the first couple of chapters of our textbook. If you're having trouble understanding this part of Witzel, it might be a good time to return to the first lecture. Witzel basically situates his own theory in terms of the entire history of the theory of myth, picking and choosing those elements that he finds particularly promising, and at the same time critiquing the tendency towards universalism or reductionism in various theories of myth. His main targets are the diffusionist school as well as the Jungians. Diffusionists such as Leo Frobenius, Stith Thompson, and H. Bauman tend to trace global mythic motifs back to Egypt and Mesopotamia, from which they spread around the globe by gradual dispersal. Having just completed our units on Egyptian and Mesopotamian myth, you can see how this might be a powerful theory. For indeed, all the elements of Witzel's Laurasian narrative are powerfully expressed in the core Egyptian myths we studied last week, as well as in Mesopotamian myths we studied the weeks before. Given the immense power and influence of ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, the diffusionist theory is indeed attractive. And there are plenty of cases where this theory works perfectly well, notably in the globalizing missionary spread of Judeo-Christian, Islamic, and Buddhist mythologies. This theory also works pretty well when it comes to 19th and 20th century developments such as Native American ghost dance or the New Guinean cargo cults, but it fails for Witzel to explain why what looks like classical Siberian shamanistic myth or versions of the Orpheus myth are so widespread across such vast distances. Not all global parallels of myth can be explained through contact and diffusion. Witzel proposes an earlier common source for the Laurasian narrative that traveled through migration, that is, more directly than diffusion. Here you can see a map for Bauman's model of diffusion from the Greater Near East, the weak points in the theory being the vast maritime distances that would have had to been traveled. More on this and why Witzel thinks his model for migration is superior in a minute. Witzel's second target are psychological theories of myth. He dismisses Freud as a modern myth maker, considers Jung's insights intriguing, especially his notion of the archetypes and the collective unconscious. He acknowledges that Jung's understanding of archetypes is attractive, convincing, fascinating, and sometimes overpowering, and could indeed explain how myths were worked out in much of the Laurasian mythic narrative. But Witzel suggests that Jung's theory works less well for Gondwana myth. And he notes how archetypes tend to function discursively as, quote, comfortable escape routes in order to avoid alternative explanatory models. Possibility of updating the Jungian analysis of myth to be a bona fide part of his Gondwana and Laurasian system is not, however, foreclosed. So it's not so much Jung that Witzel has targeted in his hairpins, but rather Joseph Campbell. I love this part because Witzel seems about as sick as I am of hearing about the hero and the hero's journey. The dripping sarcasm is evident when Witzel describes Campbell's monomyth of the typical American hero, the lone rider who dispels evil. Witzel credits Campbell as a popular and prolific writer who combines the diffusional and the archetypal theories fairly well, but he accuses him of arbitrariness, most often preferring an idiosyncratic archetypal approach, only then to formulate an entirely implausible diffusion theory. In the end, Campbell's toolbox is facile, since he randomly selects various methods to explain away the stubborn facts. Witzel recommends as an antidote a more objective, scientific, interdisciplinary, and indeed positivistic approach. This is really a fairly funny skirmish between the popular Campbell and the virtually unknown Witzel. Witzel's deepest blow to Campbell occurs when he quotes him on what are for Witzel Gondwana cultures. All writing about myth in terms of primitive versus advanced consciousness is hodgepodge with no basis in fact. Humans do not live on different levels of consciousness, and this is the plain and simple biological fact. We can see here that Witzel's main task in these passages is to forestall and put an end to the discussion of primitive versus civilized in the theory of myth. For Witzel, the facts indeed show that there is a distinction to be maintained between earlier Gondwana and later Laurasian mythological developments. But the projection of a theory of higher and lower order consciousness onto these two developments is cultural imperialism and even racism. Elements of which survive in 20th century theories of myth like Joseph Campbell's and even Karen Armstrong's when they speak of the primitive versus the civilized. Having noted the limitations of psychic universals and diffusion to explain the findings of comparative mythology, Witzel goes on to explain his own theory. According to him, Greek, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Japanese, Mayan cultures, and ultimately all of Eurasia and North America, and even Polynesia have common storylines which go back to a single source. His method and the breadth of evidence he uses is too complex to cover, but we can set out a few of his conclusions and try to speculate about their meaning. The migration of Gondwana land myth out of Africa initially follows this route. Somewhere here is where Witzel speculates that a transformation of the mythical storyline occurs. The main Gondwana storyline, however, continues through migration along this route and therefore colonizes Australia. These broken lines are a little bit misleading. Witzel is not hypothesizing necessarily that there was a maritime migration at this point. Rather, within the early migration of human beings out of Africa, there is, in addition, a line that moves up through here, across into North America, and then colonizes South America. Why there are elements of Gondwana land mythology in South America, in the high Andes, is a major question for Witzel, but it doesn't invalidate the theory. The basic model, though, is that after an initial wave of migrations of human beings across the habited world, from this point where the transformation into the Laurasian mythical storyline took place, then there was additional migrations and diffusion throughout Laurasia. So ultimately, North and South America end up being a distant land in which initially Gondwana mythology was prevalent. Laurasian mythology entered into the picture at a later date. Who or what groups of people originated the Laurasian mythological storyline somewhere around here? Witzel posits that its originator was a shaman who basically rewrote the whole story. It was the shaman's story that then, when the Earth was still scarcely populated, spread. Notice in this second map, Witzel is more clear about what he thinks he can prove. The Laurasian storyline definitely did around 20,000 BC enter into North America. Whether the elements of Gondwana land myth in South America are even elements of land myth at all is still an open question for Witzel. The basic point is that the original Pangean and Gondwana myth structure beelined it along this route, entering into Australia. And that's why the predominance of the evidence for Gondwana land myth is around here and also here. Again, Laurasian mythology could be understood most clearly on the model of a novel, that is, of the creation, growth, destruction of the world, of the divine and the human, evolution and decay from birth to death, and from creation to destruction. The narrative difference with respect to Gondwana myth is that the Gondwana narrative is not concerned at all with the creation of the universe or even the earth. The cosmos is eternal. The fundamental question that is of interest for Gondwana myth is how the earth can be shaped properly so as to make human life possible. Gondwana myth also does not possess Witzel's debt here to Mircea Eliade's book, a famous study, The Myth of the Eternal Return. Students who are still looking for a presentation topic or want to jump ship from the one they have to a more interesting one, this would be a really fun book to work on, actually. In a nutshell, Eliade posits a difference between mythological time of the first beginning and ordinary everyday time. That is the time of the ancestors and the gods in illo tempore, and the time we always live in now as contemporary. Function of myth on Witzel's Laurasian narrative, which is somewhat rooted in Eliade's eternal return idea, is what in fact defines myth for us as the origin or beginning, the development of the world and the end of the world, followed by its rebirth and renewal in an eternal cycle of repetition. This whole way of thinking about myth in terms of beginnings, peaks, and endings, followed by repetitions, what we normally think about as pagan cyclical time, is actually a narrative framework that can be traced back for Witzel to the Laurasian split from the Gondwana mythological worldview. Generally absent in Gondwana myth are the concepts origin, end, and return. Certainly the weak point in Witzel's theory is this idea of a single source for the Laurasian novel. Witzel thinks it is probably a single highly influential shaman founder figure in the early Paleolithic somewhere in India. In a 37-page summary of his own massive work, which I've uploaded for you, but it's optional to read on Canvas, you can see Witzel's concluding thoughts as to the meanings of his theory. He writes, "The very fact that Laurasian mythology, in its various derivative forms, such as Shinto, Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, etc., still satisfies the great majority of human beings in their spiritual quest is an indication of the power of the original basic concept. The Laurasian image of birth and rebirth of the universe, of nature, and of humans provides a compelling explanation and motivation for people who ask eternal questions." Another sore spot in Witzel's theory, in terms of the real-world practical application of Witzel's theory, he's very concerned that Gondwana mythologies, especially in Africa, New Guinea, and various remaining pockets of tribal religion worldwide, are almost on the verge of extinction. He writes, "It will be a great loss to human culture if the last non-Abrahamic pockets of religion, mythology, and ritual disappear. However, at present, the Laurasian storyline is attractive for more than 90% of all living humans." Witzel sums up his views in an epilogue on why learning myth is important. He writes, "In view of the human predilection for myth, it is essential that we reach an understanding of the roots and subsequent path dependencies of our own modern myths, especially so in an age of the clash of civilizations. This realization must inform us about many of our current beliefs and their underlying enduring mythological foundations. Current social and political developments around the globe necessitate a better in-depth understanding of the archaic basis for many of our dearly held beliefs." So the introduction, I've provided Witzel's own summary of his theories and his book if you get around to reading it. They only provide a very schematic picture of Witzel's theories and understanding. The chapters reconstructing the Laurasian mythological narrative using interdisciplinary techniques in Witzel's larger work are hundreds of pages each, so we all should hesitate in critiquing Witzel's theory on the basis merely of his introduction or synopsis. Nevertheless, the theory is so grandiose and totalizing that I don't think we can help making a parody version to help us understand its basic principle. The parody version goes a little like this. When a small group of humans left Africa 65,000 years ago and beelined it across the coast of the Indian Ocean to Australia, leaving settlements along the way, some sneaky shaman changed the whole story for everyone forever somewhere in India. It was that guy or gal's story that ended up migrating and transforming with peoples throughout Laurasia, becoming the global story, the end. Such a monomaniacal theory of origin almost seems ridiculous. The problem is, in Witzel's case, it's so exceptionally well researched by someone who obviously knows hundreds of times more than any of us that we kind of do have to take it seriously. The science of genetics has indeed proved that we all descend from one woman, the African Eve. Then how preposterous is it really that somewhere along the way of the human migration out of Africa story, there was a new story developed in one particular place that ended up becoming the basis of most all stories? Yeah, it's still a little ridiculous, but keep in mind, Witzel is in fact qualified to argue for this theory scientifically and in terms of the understanding of myth. Unless we read Witzel's entire large book, become familiar with many of the primary sources and theories that he utilizes, we simply aren't qualified to evaluate for and against the overall import of Witzel's theory. Probably the best we can do in a course like this is to now turn to Aboriginal Australian mythologies, since these are, within Witzel's theory, the richest source of existing evidence for Gondwana land mythology. And then, having learned more about Australian mythologies, maybe we'll be a little bit better equipped to understand what this distinction Witzel proposes between Laurasian and Gondwana really is all about. Australia is the largest global landmass where what Witzel calls Gondwana cultural narratives persisted after the exodus from Africa. Australia was inhabited by humans as early as 65,000 to 50,000 BCE. Although there were some subsequent waves of migration, debated by scholars, Australia remained largely culturally isolated until the modern period. During colonization, Aboriginal myth was diverse based on region, tribe, and dialect. But there was common, almost pan-Australian narratives such as the All-Father, the Rainbow Serpent, the Dreamtime, and the Dreaming, the establishing of the world by ancestral beings, and their withdrawal into the sky or into a sacred place on earth, as well as the myth of the songlines. Myths are communicated in Aboriginal culture orally and through symbolism such as cave, rock, and sand painting. Art and song encodes a great deal of information about features of the natural landscape and the living things within it, and instructions for how to interact with sacred places so as to survive on the land while staying in touch with the ancestral dreaming of the Dreamtime. Witzel provides a helpful summary of Aranda tribe mythological themes. Time began when supernatural beings awoke from their sleep. They broke through the surfaces of the earth, creating sacred sites throughout the land. The large animals, such as kangaroos and emus, are offspring of those supernatural ancestral beings. Human and animal forms were interchangeable at first. A lot of shape-shifting took place, and hence there is an emphasis on often large totemic animals. After emerging, the totemic ancestors brought into being the physical features of the landscape. Anima mundi, or world trees, are not uncommon, and the initiated dead are sometimes buried in them in order to return to the ancestral beings. Songs and myths, along with the styles of body decoration and symbolism, were established by the earth beings as eternal, unchangeable phenomena. Culture heroes teach men and women their respective arts. After a long while, the ancestral beings completed most of their work and got tired. Some were killed by others, many returned to sleep in the earth in sacred places and objects, the most sacred being mountains, waterholes, caves, rocks, cliff faces, and others retired to the sun. The sun, the moon, and the stars are actually sleeping ancestral beings. The most sacred places on land where ancestral beings rest can only be approached by initiated men on ceremonial occasions, but all things and places are established by and participate in the dormant ancestral beings, the dreamers, to some extent. Labor, pain, and death for human beings came into being when the ancestral beings withdrew. Now, I have a fondness for teaching Aboriginal Australian mythology because when I was 20 and an undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia, I went on a one-year exchange to the University of Sydney. During my studies in philosophy there, I took an interest in Aboriginal Australian myth, gathered together various source books from the library. I got very interested in Aboriginal sacred sites and in the songlines. When young men come of age in many Aboriginal Australian tribes, they go on a walkabout. You can see a wonderful film on this, Nicholas Roeg's 1971 film, Walkabout. In order to survive an extensive multi-month walk in the harsh Aboriginal Australian climate, young men would learn the ancestral songs, which was encoded information about the details of the natural landscape they were to traverse. Where to find watering holes, which ways to go, which ways led to certain death, natural features of the landscape to take note of. The mythical songs literally encode geological information. I'm just 20 years old and not really understanding that Aboriginal Australian sacred sites were no appropriate place for me. I located maps of the songlines in anthropological literature and superimposed them on a map of Australia's highways, tricking a local rental car company into renting me a car on the pretext of driving along the coast to Melbourne and maybe at most to Adelaide. I ended up driving straight into the desert, map of the songlines in hand, superimposed upon the accessible roads so that I could get to various sacred sites that were within 2 and 4 hours from the main highways. This month-long adventure into the Aboriginal Australian outback, I still remember as the time in my life where I saw the most beautiful places in nature I've ever seen. Enormous falcons with wingspans of over 12 feet would use the wind shear from the car in order to make their flight easier, literally flapping their wings the car window so that if you put your hand outside, you could feel the feathers. At one point, I was in a prehistoric cave with a cave painting from 15,000 BC, thought by anthropologists to be the gateway to the other world, but looking like a literal door on the cave wall. The cave was not very deep, but directly above an empty riverbed. The climate in the outback and the microclimates are so various and variable that literally while I was there meditating, an enormous thunderstorm arrived and filled the riverbed beneath. In other instances, I got lost and had to walk through a field of deadly tiger snakes to get back. I also found a Garden of Eden-like canyon, its own hospitable and lush microclimate surrounded by desert, full of layered terraces, with an enormous, beautiful, gnarled tree at its center, around whose whorls a massive tiger snake was coiled, resting in the sun. Some of the features of the Dreamtime sacred sites were so incredibly cathedral-like that it was hard to believe they were not created by humans but were in fact natural phenomena. Literal steps leading up and up and up through a canyon onto a gorgeous plateau. Sacred traditional watering holes, too, were not that difficult to find, winding through tunnel-like openings in canyons of rock for maybe half an hour. At the very end of such a walk, one might find a very deep and beautiful sacred watering hole, supposed to be one of the places where the ancestral beings had laid down to rest. Glad that I know better now than to go where I don't belong. Nevertheless, what I saw will stay with me always. The final destination was, in all events, the navel stone of the earth, or Uluru, very close to Alice Springs, in the geographic center of the continent. By this time, the car had completely broken down from the 50 degrees centigrade heat, and so after some days at Uluru, I flew back. I've included in the course pack some readings from Voigt and Drewy from a text called The Wisdom from the Earth, The Living Legacy of the Aboriginal Dreamtime. I found it interesting that this piece speaks about Aboriginal creation myths. This isn't necessarily a contradiction to Witzel's theory, since the type of creation narrative differs significantly, more like the establishing of law rather than emergence. According to Voigt and Drewy, the stories of the Dreamtime are not simple legends or fables, nor are they like the mythology of the Greeks, the Scandinavians, or the ancient Egyptians. The Dreamtime stories comprise a living mythology depicting actual events linked to specific geographical sites, which create a vast, sophisticated, cohesive, and connected series of maps of the entire Australian land. To an Aboriginal person trained in traditional law, the entire continent reveals signposts of meaning. On the term Dreamtime, they write that it was coined by explorers Spencers and Gillen in the late 20th century and promoted by an anthropologist, W.E.H. Stanner. The actual corresponding Arendt term means something more like having originated out of one's own eternity, being immortal or uncreated. The related term Alchirarma means to see or dream eternal things, to see with eternal vision. Time is only an appropriate translation if we suspend our average everyday notion of dream and dreaming. The Dreamtime is a visionary world of eternal, interconnected ancestral beings, and dreaming is the bond between the eternal moment of creation, a particular area in the land, or specific plants and animals, which symbolize vital links with the beginnings, that is, with the population of the continent by ancestral beings. For the Aborigines, nature is sacred, a sanctified and living cathedral, so it cannot and must not be changed. Jang is the spiritual energy in all things which connects them to the dreaming. Aboriginal elder Eddie Kneebone writes, Aboriginal spirituality is the belief that the soul or spirit will continue on after our physical form has passed away through death. The spirit will return to the Dreamtime where it came from. It will carry our memories to the Dreamtime and eventually return again through birth, either as a human or an animal or even trees and rocks. The shape is not important because everything is equal and shares the same spirit or soul of the dreaming. Some of the oldest cave paintings on Earth are in Australia, specifically this image of the rainbow serpent. Audrey explains, "We are different, you and me. We say that the Earth is our mother. We cannot own her, she owns us. This rock and all the rocks are alive with her spirit. They protect us, all of us. They are her. Nature is the temple of the dreaming, giving humanity shelter, a place to paint, to dance the sacred dance, and to talk to the spirit. How does one repay such gifts from the rainbow serpent?" Aboriginal Australian idea of the rainbow serpent and various other aspects of myth have been subject to some cultural appropriation. Here you see the 2016 Rainbow Serpent Festival, in which doubtless very few Aboriginal Australians participated. Lastly, I've included this week an essay by Geoffrey Barton from the text Mythscape's Aboriginal Art of the Desert. The essay is titled The Gift That Time Gave, and it recounts the origin of the contemporary Aboriginal Australian art movement in the early 1970s. In the Papunya settlement, Barton writes, Papunya was once a gentle glade of desert oaks, acacia, and mulga wood, where over 1,000 desert peoples were settled in the early 1960s. While the natural landscape surrounding the Papunya settlement is equally beautiful today as it was then. The story of Papunya is not so picturesque and inspiring. The Aboriginal Australian government was enacting during this period an assimilationist policy, rounding up surviving Aboriginal nomads and putting them into ramshackled corrugated iron transitional huts, stilt houses, in a small town with a hospital, a white-painted school, and a police station. It was here that Geoffrey Barden was a social studies teacher, participated in the beginnings of the Aboriginal art movement, which he describes as a great spiritual and artistic conflagration among the desert tribes. Through encouraging his students to create Aboriginal art and to paint murals, Barden became good friends with Aboriginal elders, hanging out with them in his air-conditioned apartment, feeding them tea, and nurturing the growing art movement. He describes in Aboriginal painting an art perception which seems to embody all the great visual and gestural imperatives of 20th century modernism in painting. Unfortunately, when Barden returned to Papunya almost 10 years later, conditions were not so favorable. The spiritual fire of a cultural rebirth of Aboriginal perception through art, now actual fires raged through burning and deserted houses, and gangs of Aboriginal children ran excitedly through the deserted, half-lit streets at night, hurling rocks through the windows of abandoned burning houses. The Honey Ant mural had been destroyed, and the settlement seemed almost tottering on the brink of a return to prehistoric oblivion. Barden describes the sadness of Tim Lura, one of the leaders of the Aboriginal art movement. "Too many roads, Chep," he would say softly, "too many," and he would move his fingers in a slight brushed-out movement. Barden tries to have a discussion with him of new maps of the Dreamtime places, and he just whispers, "No secret names, Chep, no old-time names." Barden concludes, "Perhaps it is not hard at such times to sense the visionary power of 8 or 9 years before, when everything was done wildly, lovingly, exultantly, so as to change forever that desert world, so that nothing would ever be the same again. Certainly it was not for me." You could wander all along those lost tracks which seem to enter vast Aboriginal walking circles, which become ever greater circles leading to that unconscious center of the settlement where the great brooding bullseye rests, and out of which all the native paths radiate in the hieroglyphs of an immense dreaming of sacred fire. As the desert returns irrevocably to itself, the beginnings of Aboriginal cultural revivalism, land rights, and the Aboriginal Australian tourist industry centered around the sale of Aboriginal art begins. Even today, although there are numerous books, Aboriginal myths are still poorly understood and little studied by outsiders. There do exist several excellent anthologies from the 80s and 90s, but it's not exactly a thriving field of popular interest. Thankfully, there has been a steadily increasing national and international awareness regarding the plight of Aboriginal peoples. To learn more about Aboriginal myth and culture, you could try reading Bruce Chatwin's 1987 novel The Songlines, watch Nicholas Roeg's film Walkabout, and there's even a documentary with Spock, yeah, that's Leonard Nimoy describing the Dreamtime, as well as many TED Ed talks and other documentaries, excellent websites. But despite all this, a general increase in awareness and perception, there's still an enormous gulf between what anthropologists have made available and what is generally well studied and widely discussed. If you've enjoyed your week on Witzel's Gondwana Laurasian distinction and Aboriginal Australian myth, and I'll see you next week.
There was nothing but the spirit of all life. For a long time the spirit of all life dwelt in the nothing. Then, in the mind of the spirit of life, a dreaming began.